everybody. I happen to be the Warsaw Chair in Politics, the Director of the Center for the Political Future at USC, Dornsife. On behalf of the Price School and the Price Presents series, I'm honored to moderate what promises to be an intriguing, insightful, perhaps provocative panel on rural America and understanding rural voters. Our panelists will talk with each other for 40 or 45 minutes, and then we'll open this up to questions from our audience, assuming that you've put some of those in the Q&A function. Now, let me introduce our panelists. Elizabeth Currid-Halkett is the James Irving Chair in Urban and Regional Planning at USC Price and the author of 4 books, the latest of which, as Lance just pointed out, in 2023, is entitled The Overlooked Americans. Nicholas Jacobs is a political scientist who teaches and lives in rural America. In fact, he teaches at Colby College, which is one of my favorite places, except between November and April. He's the co-author of the 2023 book, The Rural Voter, The Politics of Place and the Disuniting of America. Anthony Pippa is a senior fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development at the Brookings Institution. He launched and leads the Reimagining Rural Policy Initiative and argues that it is misleading to conclude that rural people vote against their own interests. I'm going to begin with a kind of general question and ask each of you to weigh in on it. And it takes us back some ways in history. On the eve of an election in which rural areas will vote overwhelmingly for Donald Trump, let me recall the presidential contest of 1960. On the day of the West Virginia primary, John F. Kennedy, assuming he would lose because of his religion, retreated to Washington, where he told his advisor, Ted Sorensen, that afternoon that he had never seen anything like the appalling conditions in which people were living in West Virginia. He had walked the muddy dirt roads, visited the shacks in which so many families were living, often without running water or any kind of bathroom facilities, and gone down into deeply unsafe coal mines. And he said to Sorensen that even though he would lose the primary, if he was later elected president, he was determined to do something to change that. That night, as the returns came in, he was hiding out at the movies with his wife and another couple. In the pre-cell phone era, no one could reach him with the news that he was winning the primary 60% to 40%, a landslide, until he finally returned home and then promptly flew to West Virginia. As president, one of his first initiatives was the Area Redevelopment Act, which passed through Congress and invested heavily in West Virginia and rural America generally. From then on, with the exception of the Reagan landslide, West Virginia voted reliably Democratic in every presidential election until 2000. Why did people there respond so strongly to a president who was, after all, the son of great wealth? And what changed so that West Virginia is now arguably the reddest state in America? And what can we learn from that? Elizabeth, you want to start?
Thank you, Bob. That's a terrific question. I was actually born in West Virginia. I was born in Parkersburg, West Virginia, before I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, which is actually where I am right now, visiting my family. I think one of the things that has changed, in my view, is our cultural relationship to rural America. So something happened in, I think, the wake of what you might call the knowledge economy, the movement of professionalized jobs and services into cities, the loss of manufacturing, where a lot of the values that rural Americans hold dear became minimized in the wake of a very secular, intellectual, coastal elite that ran major metro cities. And the thing that really strikes me when people criticize rural Americans for not voting in their interests, a topic we may get to later, is they are voting in a different kind of interest. They're voting in the interest of being heard for their values and their dignity. And I think that's something that has been really eroded over the past several decades. The fact that I think rural Americans, they just feel completely left out. I wouldn't say left behind as much as that they don't matter and the things that they care about don't matter.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for the question. I agree very much with Elizabeth. I often find that kind of cultural argument in some ways more satisfactory than, sort of highly political institutional argument. But certainly the parties change. There is an organizational component to this, and some of that has to do with structural changes in regional politics and the move from a Democratic monopoly in the South to a region that then becomes competitive, and now a region that once again becomes super uncompetitive. But I'll spare you that history and just compare the story you gave us of Kennedy with a story of Hillary Clinton decades later, who in Southwest Virginia, so not Virginia, but Southwest Virginia, stands before a community in Appalachia and says, we are going to put coal out of business. And then remembers that she needs to promise them jobs second. Some of that is cultural. Some of that is not appreciating certain ways of living. But I think a lot of it has to do with just the Democratic Party's fundamental transformation in the Democratic Party and how we treat rural people, how we treat rural economies, how they fit into the Democratic big tent. And they, as my colleague Dan Shea and I have written, right, these losses are decades in the making. They predate Donald Trump by 30, 35 years, and they are huge. No period in American history have we witnessed a rural-urban divide as large as we have today.
Tony, can you pick up on Elizabeth's reference to something you said, that rural people don't vote against their own interests? Tell us what their interests are and what drives them to the polls. And then Nick and Elizabeth, maybe you can add your perspectives on this.
Yeah, and when I say interests, I was referring to sort of quote unquote economic interests. Tom Frank did a book a long time ago, What's the Matter with Kansas? And it was about, why are these people voting against quote unquote their economic interest? And I guess the first thing I come to is like, who's defining that interest? Because what's behind that question is this implication that there are government transfers going into rural places, sometimes to a larger degree than they might be going into suburban or urban places. My colleagues over at the Economic Innovation Group just did actually a great study that came out last week looking at transfer payments and the growth of transfer payments as a proportion of a person's income. And that's been a significant growth in all counties, actually, in the US over the last 4 decades, and more significant in rural places. So then that begs the question, well, you're getting Social Security, you're getting Medicaid, Medicare, you're getting food stamps. Why would you be voting against your economic interest? Because generally we think of the Democrats as the party that supportive of those kinds of transfer payments. But on the other side of that, and having grown up a small town boy just 10 minutes away from where Elizabeth is right now, is a sense of what's happening to your community. And the economic self-sufficiency, or actually the headwinds that particular community is facing. And I think rural people have experienced those headwinds, and we're talking everything from we've had 190 rural hospitals close since 2005, 40% loss in bank branches in a 5-year period between 2012 and 2017, loss of local news, even things like libraries and grocery stores being under real pressure in rural communities. And there is a sense of rural dignity that is based on self-sufficiency. And a lot of those pressures I just talked about, and some of those are economic as well in terms of job losses, are based on policy decisions I mean, I was living in North Carolina running a foundation that covered the entire state when NAFTA went through. And we saw the loss of the furniture manufacturing industry, the textile manufacturing industry, and a host of other things happen in real time based on policy decision. And I think rural folks understand that some policy decisions have not really, they get the sense that policymakers are not really protecting their interests during those policy decisions. They're not interested actually in transfer payments to kind of keep their heads afloat. They want their communities to be strong, thriving, sustained over time. They don't see that happening. And so those are the interests, I think, that they're making their vote, they're casting their votes on. If we're talking about economics, I think those are the economic interests that really animate them and are driving the way in which they're making choices at the polls.
Well, since we've all talked about where we came from, I was born in a small, relatively small rural community called Connellsville, Pennsylvania. And it thrived in many ways because the Anchor hocking plant was there. The B&O Railroad used it as a major transit point. And when my stepson took me back on a roots trip like 5 or 6 years ago, I couldn't wait to get out of town. The movie theater had become a junk store. My grandfather, who actually represented that whole area, not just Connellsville, in the Pennsylvania legislature as a New Deal Democrat, his stone house on the river had been turned into a single-room occupancy. And my grandmother's house had just been knocked down because nobody wanted to buy it. The town was depopulated. Now, President Biden has actually passed legislation that will put a lot of resources into redressing some of this. There will be chip factories, there'll be rural broadband, but it takes years to get this all done. So are we going to see, by the way, I was moved to be part of the coastal elite, middle class, that is, to California when I was 8 years old. But is there any sense in those communities of hope that they will be revitalized? And does Biden get any credit?
Well, I'll leave it to Tony to describe the sort of objective on the ground, whether or not these policies are going to work. And I'll sort of emphasize the political reality. Picking up on where Tony left off, we make sense, all of us, whether we're rural or urban, right? We make sense of politics through stories, right? We tell ourselves stories about how the world works. And right, Tony was telling you a story that all three of us here in every corner of rural America, a vast space that, in some ways it's unfair to treat it as this one abstraction that we're going to talk about today, but we hear the same story, which isn't just about relative deprivation, right? Rural America, on average, poorer than non-rural America, not just one about changes in the rural economy, as Tony would, but changes that were not inevitable, right? And central to this story of non-inevitable relative deprivation is government and deliberate decisions made by government. And so what we see, and we saw this with Obamacare, right? An objectively good policy that was going to benefit rural communities more than non-rural communities on average. We saw this in the late 1990s. I think we're seeing it again. I've gathered some data on how these new programs and federal monies are being perceived, at least. What we see is an update to this story, but it's not the update that I think you want. People react to these new monies and say, okay, government's been here before. Government's told us before that they're going to fix our problems. And things not only have not improved, but arguably have made it worse. So I just finished up a new wave of data collection, now about 4 weeks old. And on each of these programs, infrastructure spending, broadband spending, and then we also tested for perceptions of renewable energy, right? Federal government spending all this money to help rural communities transition to a green economy. What we see over and over again is rural Americans not only thinking that it's going to make it worse, but making it worse because they think most of that money is going to go to people who don't need it. It's going to be upwardly redistributed. And most of that money is going to, even if it comes to a rural community, benefit people who aren't in that community. So it's going to be outwardly redistributed. And so we're in this funny moment, like even if, I'll turn to Tony right now to speak to the objective reality. Even if that money is going to do real good, government is acting in a place where a decades-long story of government always does wrong exists. And so it's this paradox that when they show up, it might actually make things worse. And we're starting to see some initial evidence of that.
Tony, you want to respond, and then Elizabeth?
Yeah, and I think Nick does a good job of outlining where the skepticism that is going to be greeted even from the outset of those large pieces of the amount of resources out of those large pieces of legislation. I think the intention and the Biden administration has really made it a major preoccupation to try to make sure those resources reach rural communities. But there are real challenges. First off, I would call those resources opportunities rather than done deals, right? We're at a place where even local governments are not necessarily well positioned or have the capacity to be able to do the things that even the federal government is going to ask of them to be able to access those funds, right? So there has to be a shot in the arm to begin with to sort of prepare the way for larger investments to happen that might be necessary in the infrastructure or manufacturing. And after 20, 30 years of disinvestment, that's not going to change overnight. So that's even a step one before you get to unleashing the economic impact of those investments. Secondly, the way we don't really have a rural policy right now, we've got a bunch of programs, right? And the way that those programs are designed are kind of to buy a widget or do a thing that, the federal government has thought really important for a community to have. So the sense of agency that a local community might feel like they have, even over directing how those resources get used, is going to be inconsistent at best. And even the large, chip manufacturing that you just talked about, Bob, you can look at a place like Central Ohio where the Intel mega plant is going in, and the surrounding jurisdictions really didn't have very much say in what was happening even to site it there, nor over what will happen with their water and their infrastructure to be able to support that manufacturing, let alone make sure it's their people that are getting those jobs. So a lot will be in the implementation and how well the implementation of these resources even happens. And then to your third point, all of that's going to take a lot of time. It took us a lot of time to get to where we are, right? It took us decades to get to this place. It's a little unfair to think that we're going to get out of it in 3 or 4 years. It's going to take, a lot of time. And who will get credit? Well, I'll leave it to the political scientists, but I'll go back to Nick and say, well, who's going to get credit for this? But it has been very difficult for the federal government, no matter the administration, to get credit for a lot of investments at the very local level. And you have to realize that a lot of that investment actually goes through the state first anyway. And so it's typically local or state politicians who end up with the credit versus the national politicians. And they may be of a different party altogether and may not have even voted for the money to begin with. And yet, and so the chain of credit and the realization for local people of where those resources are coming from and what the decision making was to get to them is not a story that they are likely to be able to tell immediately and have it affect, what their choices to vote might be.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I'd like you to comment on that, but I'm intrigued by the fact, and I mentioned this at the outset, that Kennedy somehow or other had a relationship with the people of West Virginia, to the point where his picture was up in half the houses in the state. Is it a lack of apparent connection on the part of political leaders a big part of this? I mean, Bill Clinton used to say, "I feel your pain," but he didn't anticipate the pain that was going to follow NAFTA. I mean, do we have kind of a leadership failure to communicate?
I think this is an excellent point, and I was actually going to respond by saying, I don't think that rural voters are, like any of us, that analytical about this. I mean, I don't think that Tony and Nick are wrong, that they feel the side effects of policies that go wrong or policies that are not implemented. But in reality, I think that rural America, particularly with the rise of a knowledge economy, particularly with the rise of coastal elite culture, have felt at best ignored and often ridiculed. I don't think they feel a sense of being taken seriously. They are ridiculed on The Daily Show. They are, made fun of in books like What's the Matter of Kansas. They are the Hollywood machine creates a caricature of what rural America is. Even our newspapers do to a certain extent. It's only recently, really, that they've given pause, and I've seen this influx of reportage that takes rural America seriously. And so I'm always reminded of Francis Fukuyama's quote, and I'm paraphrasing him, but that dignity trumps any economic or social needs. Your sense of dignity will override it, even if it seems economically irrational. And to me, I think that's the heart of the issue. And if we want to get into why does rural America support Donald Trump, who by all accounts is an elite himself, on some level, he has been rejected by the very elites that rural America has been rejected. There is a through line of understanding between this politician and this voting bloc.
Nick, I kind of want to pick up on that by referring to something you've written, that liberals get almost everything wrong about white rural rage. And the notion that rural whites has, as one writer said, the most racist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant, anti-gay demographic group in the country. Can you expand on that and on your argument that the reality is resentment, not rage, a sense of collective grievance?
Yeah, no, and to be sure, I know at least two liberals that get it right. No, I never. The editor did a good job creating a catchy headline. That said, I do think there is a particular argument that is routinely made by, left thought leaders. This argument about rage in particular was spouted off a couple of years ago by Paul Krugman after he read some silly op-ed written by a political scientist in the Washington Post about resentment. And Paul, he says, "Oh, why do they have to be resentful for?" Kind of like we were talking about, right? Rural people, they get a disproportionate share of federal monies. They get farm subsidies, right? And they're going through the roof. We talk about rural issues so much. What can be done to assuage their rural rage? And I'll spare you. I'm happy to go into detail on the Q&A, but I'll spare my colleagues, at least, who have read a lot of obnoxious commentary on the issue, like all the ways in which just empirically rage is not present. I mean, rage is just such a poor way of understanding motivations, policy issues, even on like culture war issues, right? Like the divides aren't as big as you'd think, and sometimes they're just not there on some of the little scare tactic stories you hear, constitutional sheriffs and the library, either way, and more or less say why I think rage is just a bad way of thinking about voters generally. Rage is an irrational response, right? You can't argue with people who are enraged. Sort of blind anger, lashing out. I think that is the argument that many thought leaders on the left have when it comes to, like, why would anybody who depends so much on government vote for a person like Donald Trump who wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act? Well, it's because they're just angry at how the world works. They're angry at how the world is changing. They're angry about how government's treated them. And to boot, they attempt to draw on scholars who talk about rural resentment as providing empirical support for this rage mentality. As somebody that writes a lot about resentment, I don't think those are the same. Resentment, to the extent that it exists in rural America, to the extent that many rural Americans feel resentment about the way they are treated, is what we were just talking about. It's that deep story. It's that longer narrative about how the world works and about how rural people and rural ways of living fit within it. I'm not. I if it's rational, irrational, what it makes sense to them, and it's not just this emotive knee-jerk response being driven by on the one hand, sort of racial change or fears of outside immigrants, or the fact that Barack Obama was the first Black president. It's rooted in something else, and I'm not the only one to have written about that. I don't think my perspective on resentment diverges too much from what Elizabeth and Tony have already put out there. But to say that it's rage is quite misleading.
Elizabeth, you've traveled around and spent a lot of time in these rural communities, not just visiting your folks or your friends, but doing research. What about that quote that I used in the question, where you have a writer who said that rural folks are the most racist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant, anti-gay demographic group in the country? Is that a driver of this, or is it even true?
I think it's a wildly incorrect statement. And I, like Nicholas, have written publicly about how inaccurate this book is. It does such a disservice to this country. It sells books. And I also think, aligns with my observation before, which is that there is a desire to believe rural America as being backwards or ignorant. And perhaps that is the way coastal liberal elites explain that they voted for Donald Trump. They must be these terrible people. I don't know. I'm hypothesizing. But in reality, I didn't meet a single xenophobic, homophobic, racist person at any point. I spent hours with people. They were very honest with me about all sorts of things. And that was nothing that came up. The data actually shows the same. If you look at the University of Chicago's General Social Survey, and you ask rural folks about, preferential hiring for the Black community, uplifting the Black community, gender equality, sometimes they actually are more supportive than their urban counterparts of these kinds of social initiatives. So it is just a very off base. And like Nicholas, I read White Rural Rage, and there's not an enormous amount of primary research. So I will say, as a researcher, I think maybe they need to talk to more rural Americans.
Tony?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to add beyond Nick and Elizabeth. And, I travel around to a lot of communities for the work that we do and for the podcast that I do, actually. And what's interesting to me as well at the very local level, especially in places where they may have fallen on hard times or experienced some kind of economic or social shocks, they're often not focused on the national politics of what's happening. They are worried about what's happening to their place. You just described Connellsville in Pennsylvania. I can tell you, like, if you were to go talk to the mayor and the city council, like they are worried about that place. And that crosses political lines, actually. It crosses a lot of different kinds of lines. And so to think that, at best, there is a sense of despair around what's happening in that place, or at worst, at best, there is a, hey, we got to get nobody's coming to save us. We got to do this ourselves, and we're going to figure this out. And there's, in some places, like some incredible civic collaboration going on that we're actually missing, because to Elizabeth's point, we paint everything with this really broad brush. And culturally, we have this idea that those communities work in a particular way or in a particularly different way. One thing that I would also point to is that the nationalization of our news and the nationalization of our politics have been also, this is not a policy movement, but they have also not been very healthy for rural America. Because smaller places thrive on their own stories, and they don't see that story reflected actually in those national news, and they've lost a lot of local news, frankly. And so even the accountability and the working out in the public sphere of what's happening in their local communities or in their regions is much more difficult to access. And what fills the vacuum is, national politics and national news. And so you're actually feeding your what Nick might even call resentments into the national dialogue rather than what's actually really happening locally.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to take a chance on this next question, and I think we'll start with Elizabeth. You've each spent a lot of time, Nick, almost all your time, in rural America. Have you been surprised? Are you surprised by some of what you see there? And does any of it confound your expectations or preconceptions?
It's a wonderful question, Robert. So when I started doing this research, it was right after 2016. I grew up in small town America. I was around dinner parties and reading, postal elite media in shorthand that was very concerned and confused and thought that rural America was angry. That part I knew wasn't true. So when I came to rural America and spent a lot of time with rural Americans, I wasn't surprised that they weren't angry. I knew they weren't angry because I grew up in rural America. They weren't. They were contented for the most part. What surprised me was the extent of the commonalities amongst urban and rural Americans. I mean, if you really get down to it, we care about a lot of the same stuff. We care about democracy. We're worried about it. We care about the environment in different ways. Most of us are very supportive of marriage equality, and no one I talk to is a racist. So I think the important thing for me was, wow, like if we just stopped making politics define us and just talked about the things we cared about, we'd probably all be able to have dinner together for a long time, because there isn't that much of a difference when it comes to basic human needs, desires, and cares. And I don't mean that in some sort of soft, sentimental way. I actually mean that quite practically, that we have allowed our politics to just overshadow everything. It defines everything about a person in this country, and it's just not.
Tony, you want to comment on that?
I'm going to turn that a little bit on its head and talk about how surprised I was, quite honestly. And maybe it's because of, having come from a small place and then for a lot of my career having worked in smaller places, was actually how ignorant, and I don't mean that in the pejorative sense, but just how unknowing people in policymaking and in decision-making places are around rural and small places. It has been really surprising to me the extent to which people don't go to small places, don't really know how those communities work, don't realize how how acute they feel change when change does happen, and how at risk they are for certain kinds of changes, and how rural is not a downsizing of urban or suburban, but is actually has its own unique set of characteristics that actually has implications for policymaking and for other things. And so what's really surprised me is the schism of how blind many folks are to the interdependencies between rural and urban America and how much they need each other. And that's been really surprising to me on the urban and the sort of the policymaking side. And I'll just say one thing about that, one very quick example of that. Action on climate change, a shift to a clean energy economy. 99.8% of the wind farms and 74% of the solar farms in America are located in rural places. And yet they are very much not a part of the policymaking conversation when it comes to climate change or the clean energy economy. So I'll just leave it at that.
Nick, you live there all the time. Anything surprise you?
Yeah, and I don't think this sits in tension with what Elizabeth said. I agree, and I with the exception of gun policy, I agree full-heartedly that at least on the pressing political issues of the day, there is surprising agreement, at least when we give people the opportunity to speak for themselves on what they want. Right. And I think we periodically get re-surprised when voters themselves are allowed to express their opinions on things like abortion referenda, how rural areas will under or overperform compared to the partisan alignment of the region. And I think that speaks to Elizabeth's point about finding much more in common between these spaces. But what I was very much expecting and didn't feel like it was too disruptive of my theory going into writing the book to say, well, okay, we talk about rural voters as this thing, and rural voters on average have gravitated in their politics over time in this one way, but there's important differences across rural America. And there are some important differences in politics, right? I mean, when we talk about rural-urban gaps in Wisconsin or Michigan, we're talking gaps of 5 or 6 points. When we're talking about rural and urban gaps in voting in Pennsylvania, we're talking like 40 points. So there are big partisan differences regionally. But what I was surprised to learn is that when it comes to these core sets of ideas about what it means to be rural, so not policy issues, not who you're going to vote for, but like, what does rural mean to you, and how are rural people treated? Rural folks in the West, which is a very different world, are very similar to rural folks in the South, or similar to my neighbors up here in rural North New England. This idea of a sort of national rural identity, again, I was kind of expecting to find more caveats than I did, but rural people everywhere are telling themselves a very similar story about where our culture is and where our politics is, even though it manifests in very place-specific ways.
So I'm going to turn to audience questions because we have a bunch of them in a moment, but I want to get down to the bottom line here. And maybe I should mention rural political transformation, because as I told you, my grandfather was a New Deal Democrat, was elected over and over and over again in southwestern Pennsylvania. When I went back, the town was filled with signs about guns and about the 10 Commandments. And right now, I think it's filled with Trump signs. Now, the Harris campaign is investing a lot of resources in these rural areas, not in hopes of winning them, but hoping to lower the margin by which she loses there. And there's some evidence that it may be working. Harry Enton on CNN this morning said Trump won by 33% in 2016 in rural areas among white working class voters, by 30 points in 2020, and now down to 27 points. 6-point shift could actually determine the outcome of the election. Do you have any explanation for that? Why is there less identification with him than, marginally less than there was before? And how politically consequential can it be? And anybody can take this.
I'll just say something quick. I'm not a political scientist, so I'll let Nick talk about statistical breakdowns. But my sense is that Donald Trump is a known entity now. So I think when he came on the scene initially, there was a lot less we knew about him. And I think there are things about him now that some rural voters don't like. Now, whether that means that they're going to show up at the poll and vote for Harris, or whether it means that they're going to stay at home is a question. But I think that's a part of it, is that some of the behaviors that people in the Democratic Party don't like are behaviors that people in rural America don't like either.
Nick?
I agree with that about Trump being a known quantity. I think some of the anti-establishment luster has worn off. I'll say the Democratic Party crossed the exceptionally low bar of selecting a candidate who says we should actually talk to rural people as if they're good people. And, I don't think that's going to make too big of a difference on the margins. But one thing that is certainly true is that many rural progressives and rural Democrats, because they are there even in the deepest of red counties and towns, finally feel heard and finally feel seen and more motivated to knock on those doors. They don't need to close. Democratic Party, Harris campaign does not need to close the rural gap everywhere. They only need to close it in a few places, and Biden succeeded in closing the rural gap in those few places in 2020 by, wow, what a novel strategy, actually going to Michigan, actually running a campaign in these places and not taking them for granted. And it was, some of that was won in the suburbs, but some of that was also closing the margins from 2016 and 2020. And, even if they just hold on to that margin, they will be more successful in this race. But I'm of two minds, and and I don't think these are in contradiction with one another. Both can be true. There's certainly something about Donald Trump that resonates in rural America. Elizabeth hinted at what I think is a spot on, like this this authenticity that the most urbane, like, caricature of a candidate does well with rural folks, because he doesn't pretend to be something he's not, right? He doesn't throw on a Carhartt jacket and pretend to know the lived experiences of people. But there is also deep antipathy towards the Democratic Party. And it would be a lot to expect any one candidate to change decades of people's minds and what the Democratic Party is, who they are, what they stand for. And so I think we're more probably likely to be a redo of 2020 than sort of an inflection point where there's serious turns back to the Democrats.
Yeah, I don't think there are going to be serious turns back to the Democrats. I think it's very marginal. I mean, these numbers went from a Trump 33-point advantage 2016 to a 30-point advantage in 2020 to a 27-point advantage in the polling right now. So we'll have to see where it ends up. Tony, do we need a combination of candidates who pay attention to these areas and policies that are felt in these places and felt more immediately than they are now?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think the cultural dimensions and the political dimensions that you're talking about with Elizabeth and Nick are exactly right. You do need to be able to communicate to voters. Voters need to see themselves reflected in you or what you're talking about, you need to be able to connect on an emotional level. And frankly, the Democratic Party for a long time didn't invest in doing even that. They didn't even run people in a lot of local races or places like this. But I also think you do need good policy, right? Then there needs to be policy that goes along with that. And it is interesting, if you look at the Harris-Walz campaign has put out a rural action plan. And if you look at that rural action plan and you look back to the Hillary Clinton campaign, which also had a rural plan, you know, a lot of what passes for these plans are, well, here's our policy priority. You know, we're going to build $3 million house, 3 million houses around the housing shortage, like the Harris-Walz campaign. And that's going to help rural America because it's like the larger policy. And the implication is it's going to ripple down to rural America somehow. But the Harris-Walz and that's how a lot of the Hillary Clinton campaign was. That was what their action plan was. But if you also look at the Harris-Walz action plan, it's got a very specific set of proposals around rural healthcare. And it fits rural healthcare. It takes into account the closure of rural hospitals, the workforce shortages for healthcare that rural places are feeling, telehealth, the extension of Medicare benefits for telehealth. Like those are specifically rural. So we do need policy that is about the specific issues and ways in which rural places are being affected by shifts in the economy or by social shifts. And I think you need the combination of both. I think you need good rural specific policy as well as the candidates that really know how to connect culturally and emotionally with those particular voters.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just real quick, Bob. Tony, I'm glad you brought up healthcare because that is a part of the plan that when you ask rural people, like most important issue, sort of outside of the amorphous economy, it's not gay people getting married. It's not, you know, what other issue in that slur of words that were trotted out earlier. It's healthcare. It's healthcare. And then to make it specific. The other thing I'd note with this plan that was notable and has gotten a lot of traction among rural journalists or journalists that cover rural areas is that it also had a strong deregulatory component insofar as like deregulating industries that have been regulated for corporate interests. So you could say deregulatory or anti-corporate components. Taking on corporate consolidation in agriculture, meatpacking, and Walz gave a pretty fiery speech on those issues, and those poll exceptionally well. A lot of these communities are communities that in 2016 were a part of Bernie Sanders' support for reforming government and ending corporate welfare and government policies that benefit big industries at the expense of little industries that have been pushed out over the decades. And you know, it was interesting to see a Democrat talk about those things. I think they've been uncomfortable with that reality that government has done harm in the past. And reforming government to do good might be a necessary step in the right direction. So,
by the way, when listening to all this, I'm reminded of Richard Neustadt's observation that the greatest power of the presidency is actually the power to communicate. And if you can't communicate, or if your communication is defective or doesn't pay attention, then you're probably going to lose a lot of voters. Now, we have some questions. And people, you should feel free to disagree with the very premise of the question if you want. And maybe we will try not to have all three of you answer all of them, or we're not going to get through all of them anyway. So the first question is, Republicans have made the debate about abortion a central rallying cry. How and why have they been so successful using this issue to energize their base, rural base, compared to a Democratic Party that's so divided? By the way, I'd have to say, the Democratic Party is not divided on the issue of reproductive rights. Anyone want to take that? Because we barely mentioned abortion here.
I mean, I'll just jump in and say I'm surprised by the question because my understanding is that 80% of Americans are supportive of some form of reproductive rights. So I'm actually quite perplexed if that's the truth.
No, I said, you're free to disagree with the question. Go ahead, Nick.
Well, I don't see it as a rural issue. Polling would suggest similarly, right? To be honest, if I wanted to maximize the likelihood of finding somebody that held a certain belief on restricting access to reproductive care, I'd go to the suburbs in Long Island, New York. I would walk down Levittown and guarantee you I could find a good Catholic family that votes hardcore Republican and is on that side of the issue, right? This is an issue on which Americans are divided. Marginally a little higher in rural communities, but that tends to be because they are a little older, not actually motivated by religion in some cases. And so I don't see it as a major rural issue.
Okay, let me move on to the next question, which is related in some way. I understand the rural folks feel left behind, and I empathize with them. But why do they resonate with Donald Trump as their leader? I believe rural areas, Republicans in rural areas tend to have very strong Christian values. But some of Trump's comments seem to grab attention the wrong way. So I understand why they'd be American, why they'd be Republican, but I see quite a few other Republican candidates that could be great for America. So why not the others? What about Trump's conduct? And I think rural areas, correct me if I'm wrong, I think rural areas are more religious than the country as a whole.
I'll let the political scientists like Nick kind of unwind the science there. I will say that first off, we have to recognize, like the county that I grew up in Pennsylvania, a good 20% or even more of the people who voted for Obama in that county then turned around and voted for Trump in the 2016 election, right? So part of it is, I think, the impulse for change. And they tried change with sort of the audacity of hope, and then they were ready to kind of blow the whole system up. And to Nick's point, the kind of anti-corporate, the protection of kind of the corporate consolidation of a lot of things, I think is really meaningful to rural people. And that's what they're looking for. I also think, and Nick, referenced this a little earlier as well, the just be who you are and be as off color as you want to be as well. There's some authenticity there that is resonating, even if it's actually not in line with the religious values that people might hold. They feel like, they're not getting BS'd. In fact, they feel like they know when it is BS, and they can set that aside because there's a willingness there to go after some of the things that they feel that they really care about.
Well, and also just to jump in, I think this comes full circle to Robert's original observation about Kennedy. It may not even be entirely a vote for Donald Trump as much as it's a vote against a Democratic Party that used to care about rural voters and rural values and has now been swept up in the tech industry, the Ivy League, the coasts, the Pilates almond latte drinking cohort, who speak a different cultural currency and a different cultural language, which often is quite, dismissive of rural values. So do you vote for Trump because you love Trump, or do you vote for Trump because you're definitely not voting for a Democrat? Nick?
Yeah, and some of the no, I agree with all of this. Some evidence that we have from some nationally representative survey work taken back in February when Biden was still on the ticket suggested that 55% of rural voters for Trump were voting for Trump, 45% were voting against Biden. Okay. And that fluctuates, and that's going to depend on the state. I do believe that even though a lot of this is driven, against the Democratic Party, that there is something about Trump. I agree that there was something authentically refreshing in the minds of many voters about who he was. And so then we're sort of given, the follow-up question always is, well, why do they still? People can maybe make sense of it in 2016, but now after 4 years, like, why still? And I think that's a good question. I think that's fair if that's on your mind. We could roll out the statistics and the economics that rural people were no better off, if not worse, under a Trump administration. But here's where I think perceptions and politics are really important to understand. After Donald Trump won and our sort of liberal echo chambers, all right, our perceptions of how the country worked were shattered, and we all went looking for explanations as to why people would vote for this man. Rural people were blamed for Donald Trump, right? Frank Rich in New York, the New York Magazine, no sympathy for the hillbilly. Let them have their cake and eat it too. Right? And then you get books saying this is the threat to America, right? They're the ones that are destroying our democracy. If anything, I'm kind of surprised that they're not, like, rural voters aren't more sort of sticking to their guns. Thank God they don't read New York Magazine and buy New York Times bestseller list. Otherwise they would probably be more on the defensive, because as a group, they were put at the center of this crisis that liberals were having as to Trump's rise. Unfairly, by the way, because Donald Trump won twice as many votes outside of rural communities as he did within rural communities. But either way, had to get that one in there.
I think this is an interesting question, and we're not going to have time for any others, but it fascinated me, and I'd like to hear your take on it. How do rural Americans compare to rural voters in other countries? Do we see a similar urban-rural divide in Canada and Western Europe, or is there something unique to the U.S. that causes these gaps, these fissures?
I mean, the quick answer to that is yes, you actually are seeing some of the similar divides, both politically as well as economically, like the economic divergence as well. And sometimes not as stark, and every place has its own politics, and I think part of it's based on candidacies as well. But I mean, similar to the way in which you've got populism that is not just in one country, but is really in a lot of higher income countries. I do think you are seeing some divides, rural to urban, as well as a lower level of trust. I mean, we've kind of implied it in a lot of different of our answers here, but we haven't said it explicitly. But rural folks just don't really trust the government, or have a greater deal of skepticism that the government's going to be good for them and do right by them. And that is also that lower level of trust actually is also pretty consistent along a lot of high income countries.
Nick or Elizabeth, go ahead.
I'll let Elizabeth have the last word, because mine is really just a quick point. Absolutely, yes. But especially in terms of economics and how public opinion is arranged geographically, we have this geography of discontent that comparative politics scholars talk about. But the fascinating thing, right, a lot of what we've been talking about for the last hour is how this is a problem in our politics, right? There's an economic problem of rurality, there's a social problem of rurality, but really what we're discussing is a political problem. In other countries, they do things differently there. And the rural and urban divide in public opinion and economic inequality, it has not roiled their political systems as much. You've seen third parties emerge in parliamentary democracies. You've seen strong commitments to decentralization, for instance, in Canada, and provincial government negotiate these rural-urban divides differently. In our highly national and polarized system, it has just become a flash in the pan. But that means it's a political problem. Sorry, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth?
I have 10 seconds, which is that, yes, I think so. I think in the UK, we're seeing a bit of it. But anecdotally, two of my doctoral students, one from China and one from India, came up to me and said, I read your book, and this is happening in our countries too. And particularly what they were talking about was the cultural capital divide between urban and rural. That's what they were really interested in. It was the fact that urban cultural capital doesn't value rural cultural capital in the same way. So that's all I have for you. I don't have a lot of observations.
So I want to thank Nick, Elizabeth, and Tony for what, at least for me, was a great discussion. I want to thank our audience. I want to tell folks, because we had a total of 11 questions come in. I'm sorry I didn't get to more of them. And go to the USC Price Presents page. That's how I found it. You just Google USC Price Presents, and you'll see a whole series of upcoming programs, which I think you'll be interested in. Thank you all. Have a great week.